I work in healthcare sales, so I spend a lot of time in hospitals talking to doctors and nurses. My job is to explain how our product works, answer their questions, and show them how it can help their patients. I visit different departments and meet with various medical teams to ensure they understand everything about the product. Today, I didn't have any product training or sales meetings planned, so I decided to visit a hospital I hadn't been to before. It was located a few towns away from where I live, and I thought it would be a good chance to introduce myself. I brought a box of coffee and some baked goods for the doctors, nurses, and staff, hoping it would break the ice and get them interested in talking to me. My goal was to make a good impression and, hopefully, get them to schedule a meeting to discuss our product in more detail. I recently moved to a new place for this job, and I've been enjoying visiting different hospitals and getting to know my new state while working. I hadn't been to this area before, but the hospital stood out as soon as I saw it in the distance. The building was huge with a modern design and looked spotless. The gardens around the hospital were well kept, with neatly trimmed grass and flowers. The parking lot was completely full, showing how busy the place was. I got lucky and found a parking spot close to the entrance. I got out of my car with the coffee and treats and walked toward the front doors. They were locked, so I needed to be buzzed in, which was pretty normal since the pandemic began. There was a sign asking me to say the name of the doctor or patient I was visiting when I rang the buzzer. The front sliding doors opened, and I walked inside. The lobby was empty, completely abandoned. Old, worn-out wheelchairs were scattered around, some tipped over in odd positions. I didn't see any staff or visitors anywhere, which made the place feel even more deserted. It was a huge hospital in a busy city, but not a single person was sitting in the waiting area. The decor looked very old and didn't match the impressive exterior of the building at all. The waiting chairs had faded designs and looked like they hadn't been used in years. The carpet was dirty and stained, and the glass doors to the connected rooms were cloudy and unclean. Feeling a bit surprised, I walked over to the front desk, but no one was there. It looked like no one had been there for a long time. The entire desk was empty, there wasn't even a pen, computer, or cup of coffee in sight. It felt strange to see such an empty space in a hospital. There was a rotary phone on the desk, yes, a real rotary phone. I'm 28, and I honestly think this was the first time I had to use one. The phone had a dusty surface, as if it hadn't been touched in ages. A handwritten note taped to it said, "Dial 0 for operator." The note looked old and worn, adding to the feeling that this place had been forgotten. I picked up the phone, but there was no dial tone. I hung up and tried again, but it was completely dead. By this point, I was really freaked out, but I was still determined to get the coffee and my business cards to the right people. I turned around and saw that I was still completely alone. There weren't any patients or staff in sight. I couldn't even hear distant voices or the usual sounds of a busy hospital. I set the coffee and food down on the front desk and started to look around, glancing up and down the hallway. The left side was completely dark, making it hard to see, and it looked like the light bulb had burned out. Still, I didn't see anyone, no doctors, no patients, and no nurses. That's when I started to feel uneasy. The silence was growing louder, and the strange feeling I had when I walked in was getting stronger. The empty chairs in the waiting area only added to the weirdness. My whole job is about spending time in places like this, so I know how busy hospitals usually are, but this felt completely different. I went back to the lobby and picked up the items I had brought. As I was leaving, I counted 7 wheelchairs in the lobby, arranged as if they had been left behind in a hurry. When I stepped back through the front doors into the parking lot, a wave of relief washed over me. The strange feeling was gone, but I felt a little disappointed that I didn't get to meet my potential future clients. I drove around the building to see if there was another entrance I should have used. Maybe this one was under construction, but I didn't see anything different. The only other door was a back door that looked closed and uninviting. Frustrated, I decided to call my coworker, who I had taken the territory over from, to ask if they had ever been to this facility. I thought they could give me some advice or at least let me know if they had experienced anything strange there. They said they had been there several times before, and the waiting room was nothing like I described. I had always been intrigued by abandoned places, but working as a contract custodian in an old hospital was not something I'd ever planned for. When my company was hired to clean up St. Margaret's, a facility closed for over 40 years, I knew it would be unsettling. The hospital was notorious in its heyday for housing the criminally insane and was the site of numerous alleged deaths due to neglect. The project was straightforward: clean out the upper levels so a construction crew could assess the building's structural integrity. I arrived at the hospital early on a foggy Monday morning, the damp air clinging to my skin. From the outside, St. Margaret's looked like a fortress of misery. Its once grand Gothic arches had been eroded by decades of weather, leaving the stone cracked and jagged. Inside, the air was stale and heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang that I couldn't place. The main hallway stretched out before me, the peeling wallpaper and broken light fixtures creating a jagged path to the unknown. My coworker, Greg, a laid-back guy with a penchant for ghost stories, gave me a grin. "Think we'll meet the infamous Hollow Eyes," he joked, referring to the hospital's most famous urban legend, a spirit said to haunt the upper floors. According to the story, Hollow Eyes was a former patient whose face had been grotesquely disfigured during an experimental surgery. I laughed nervously, pretending I wasn't already spooked. "Let's just focus on getting this done." We started on the 3rd floor, working our way through the patient rooms. Each room was a snapshot of despair: rusted bed frames, shattered mirrors, and scribbled phrases on the walls like, "They watch through the cracks," and "No escape from the dark." I chalked it up to the ramblings of disturbed minds, but the eerie atmosphere was hard to ignore. By midday, Greg and I had covered most of the floor, leaving only the northern wing. This section had been sealed off due to structural concerns, but the construction team insisted we clear it out for inspection. The air grew colder as we approached, and the hum of the city outside faded into an unnatural silence. "Did you feel that?" Greg whispered as we stood before the door to the northern wing. "Feel what?" I asked, though I already knew what he meant. The air seemed to vibrate faintly, a low, almost imperceptible thrumming that seemed to emanate from behind the door. We forced the door open, the creak echoing like a scream in the silent corridor. The northern wing was darker than the rest of the building, its windows covered with grime so thick it blocked out the daylight. Our flashlights barely cut through the gloom, revealing shadowy outlines of overturned furniture and scattered medical equipment. As we moved deeper into the wing, the oppressive silence was broken by faint sounds, soft whispers, the shuffle of feet, and the occasional metallic clink. "Probably rats," Greg said, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. Then we found the room. Unlike the others, this door was pristine, its paint unchipped and its brass handle gleaming. A plaque beside the door read, "Ward C-13. Greg hesitated, but I pushed the door open, revealing a room that looked untouched by time. The bed was made, the desk neatly arranged, and a faint scent of lavender lingered in the air. "What the hell?" Greg muttered, stepping inside. That's when we noticed the journal on the desk. Its leather cover was cracked with age, and the pages were filled with elegant handwriting. The entries detailed a patient's descent into madness, describing a shadowy figure that watched from the corners and whispered their darkest fears. Greg flipped to the last page, and his face went pale. The final entry read, "They come when the light fades. Hollow Eyes sees everything." Before I could process what I'd read, the temperature plummeted, and the door slammed shut behind us. The lavender scent was replaced by the stench of rot, and the whispers returned, louder now, overlapping in a chaotic cacophony. "Let's get out of here," I said, but Greg was frozen, staring at the corner of the room. "Do you see it?" he whispered. I turned, and my flashlight landed on a figure crouched in the shadows. Its face was obscured, but its hollow, black eyes burned into me, unblinking. It moved, its limbs jerking unnaturally, and the whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar. I grabbed Greg and bolted for the door, yanking it open with all my strength. We ran down the corridor, the sound of scraping footsteps chasing us. As we reached the stairwell, Greg stumbled, and I turned to help him, only to see the figure standing at the top of the stairs. Its face was a grotesque mask of scars, and its hollow eyes seemed to pull the light from the room. Somehow, we made it out of the building. Outside, the sunlight felt surreal, too bright and too warm. Greg and I didn't speak on the drive back to the company office. The next day, I learned Greg hadn't shown up for work. When I called him, his girlfriend answered, saying he'd been muttering about eyes in the dark all night before disappearing in the early hours. I quit the job a week later. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake up to the faint sound of whispers and the feeling that something is watching me from the shadows. I work as a night shift security guard at a large hospital, and my job brings me into contact with all sorts of strange situations. It's a quiet, isolated kind of work, and for the most part, my nights are uneventful. My experiences range from completely normal to moments that are harder to explain, situations that linger in your mind, making you question what's real. Some nights, I don't encounter anything unusual at all. But then, there are nights like this one. Lately, I've noticed a shift. Strange things seem to be happening more often, becoming harder to brush off as coincidences or tricks of the mind. I don't know if it's just me or if something is truly changing, but I can't deny the uneasy feeling that has been creeping into my shifts. This particular night started like any other. Over the weekend, the hospital had only one patient left, but they were discharged around 6 p.m. By 7 p.m., all the nurses and staff had clocked out, leaving me alone in the building. Nights here are typically quiet, and I've grown used to the solitude. As a college student, I used the downtime to catch up on homework. That night, I was seated at my desk, surrounded by textbooks and notes, when the phone on my desk rang. The sound startled me. It's not unusual for the phone to ring during my shift, but it's almost always a fluke. Usually, when I answer, no one is on the other end, just dead air. But this time was different. When I picked up the phone, I was met with a faint crackling static. Straining to hear, I realized there was something else, something beneath the static. It was a voice. A woman's voice. "Hello?" I said, unsure of what to expect. The voice came through faintly, distorted by the static, but I could make out her words. "I'm locked in the waiting room," she said. "Can you let me out?" This wasn't entirely out of the ordinary. Sometimes, the cleaning crew accidentally gets locked in the waiting room. The doors there have an automatic lock feature, and once they close, you need a key to open them. There are 2 waiting rooms in the hospital, one near my desk and another at the far end of the building, closer to the parking lot. Assuming she was in one of them, I grabbed my keys and hurried off to help her. When I reached the waiting room near the parking lot, it was empty. The lights were dim, casting long shadows across the room, but there was no sign of anyone. I called out, but the only response was the low hum of the fluorescent lights. Feeling a little unsettled, I returned to my desk. I reasoned that maybe she'd found her way out before I got there. It wasn't worth overthinking. I settled back into my chair and tried to focus on my homework. About 30 minutes later, the phone rang again. It was the same static-filled connection, the same faint woman's voice. "I'm still in the waiting room," she said, her tone more urgent this time. Confused, I asked, "Which waiting room are you in?" "I just checked the one by the parking lot, and no one was there." "The waiting room by the parking lot," she insisted. I felt a pang of concern mixed with frustration. If she was really there, how could I have missed her? Grabbing my keys again, I headed back to check. The waiting room was just as empty as before. I stood there for a moment, scanning every corner, listening for any sign of movement. Nothing. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels unnatural in a hospital. I glanced at the security monitor mounted nearby. The live feed showed the waiting room, just as empty as it was in front of me. The camera hadn't even been triggered by movement. Feeling unsettled, I returned to my desk, trying to shake off the strange encounter. Maybe it was a prank, I thought, or maybe someone was confused about their location. But then, 15 to 20 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, her voice sounded different, sharper, more impatient. "Why haven't you let me out yet?" she asked, her words distorted but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. I asked her again which waiting room she was in. "I'm by the parking lot," she said. "I was just visiting my son." Her words stopped me cold. I suddenly remembered, we hadn't had any patients since 6 p.m., and the only one we discharged was an elderly woman. There had been no visitors, no children, and certainly no one who fit this woman's description. I felt a chill creep over me. My voice was steadier than I expected when I responded. "Ma'am, I've checked both waiting rooms, and you're not in either of them." There was a long pause. Then, through the static, I heard a soft, unsettling giggle. The line went dead. I stared at the phone for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally moved, I checked the call history. None of the numbers were recognizable, and when I tried calling them back, they were all inactive. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Who had I been talking to? I sat back at my desk, trying to piece it together. I considered the possibility of a prank. Maybe someone was messing with me, using a phone app to spoof numbers. It was the most logical explanation, but it didn't quite fit. The voice, the giggle, the eerie silence in the waiting room, none of it felt like a prank. It felt different. I'm a skeptic by nature. I like to think there's a rational explanation for everything. But this experience has been added to the list of things I can't fully explain. Some nights, I still think about that woman's voice and the static-filled calls. I wonder if she'll call again, or if this was just a one-time event. Whatever the case, I'm not sure I'll ever forget that unsettling night. My dad is finishing his last few days of treatment at a state hospital, so I went to visit him for Father's Day. He has been at a facility in Jamestown, North Dakota, for several months now. The building has a long history, which makes it a bit interesting. During my visit, we started talking about creepy things and his experiences there. He shared some strange stories about things he has seen and heard while staying at the facility. The hospital opened in 1885 and became a place for people with mental illnesses and those who committed crimes. It was built to help those in need, but within just a few years, it faced a serious problem with overcrowding. The number of patients kept increasing, so the hospital had to expand many times to accommodate everyone. But unfortunately, it still didn't have enough staff to care for all the patients properly. By 1937, the situation became even more complicated, so the governor decided to fire the hospital superintendent who was in charge of the facility, along with 75% of the staff. He replaced them with new people. Many of the new hires were chosen because of their political donations rather than their experience. After the governor fired most of the staff, the new workers were not qualified to care for the patients. They treated the patients very poorly. By 1949, the situation became public when newspapers reported on the overcrowding and neglect at the hospital. They highlighted the problems of malnutrition, where many patients did not get enough food. By 1953, reforms started to take place as the government and hospital officials recognized the need for change. New policies were put in place to improve care, hire qualified staff, and ensure the safety and well-being of the patients. As a result, things at the hospital began to get better, and the patients received the care they needed. By 1974, the number of patients at the hospital had dropped from over 2,000 in the 1940s to about 600. Today, there are around 200 patients. My dad liked to stay busy there, so he would always take on different jobs, whether it was helping with activities for the patients, assisting the staff, or volunteering for various programs. From what I understand, the hospital was like a partner institution to his rehab center, but the people there were treated more like inmates while he had more freedom and could leave when he wanted. He went to the part of the hospital that acts like a prison today and helped one of the ladies who works there with the laundry. They folded a lot of sheets and towels and then went downstairs for a while to get something. When they returned, they found the sheets thrown on the floor and all messed up, which surprised them. It's important to note that everything in that area is kept locked, so no one could have gone in there to cause the mess. The lady who worked there told my dad that it was Charlie, the ghost that is said to haunt that part of the prison. The lady told my dad that they have names for different ghosts because there are so many of them. They even have a few rooms that they had to block off because whenever a resident or inmate moved into those rooms, they would refuse to stay because so many creepy things would happen. Even the old warden's office was so haunted that he told the staff if they couldn't find him a new space for his things, he would quit his job and leave. My dad said that strange things would happen there, like objects moving on their own and even flying off the shelves, which scared everyone. Since my dad could leave the facility often and had a job outside, he and a couple of guys decided to take a local job doing lawn work. They were responsible for maintaining the grounds around the hospital and the nearby cemetery. One day, he was working with a small group of guys in the middle of the afternoon. The area of the hospital grounds they were working on is no longer in use, but the building they were near had many windows, so you could see everything inside. Then he and another guy saw someone walking around inside the building, so they told their boss that someone else was working there also. My dad and the guy thought it was strange to see someone in a place that had been empty for years, but their boss laughed it off, joking about seeing a ghost and thinking it was just their imagination playing tricks on them. My dad is a no-nonsense kind of guy, but he and the other guys saw the figure clearly enough to notice his clothes and everything. "Did you see what he was wearing?" the other guy asked my dad in a scared voice. "Yeah," my dad replied. "Someone's messing with us." That was a person. Then they saw the figure again. My dad said the same ghostly figure came walking quickly down the hallway toward them. They could still see through the window and darted around the corner into the garage. He was wearing an old-fashioned black and white suit with a matching hat, and he kept his head down like he was trying to hide his face from them. The guy with my dad took off running, saying he was done with working there because he was so scared. But my dad yelled at him to run around to the front so they could catch the person who was trying to scare them. They checked all the possible doors, but absolutely nobody was there. Somehow the boss got the keys so they could investigate that part of the building. My dad said it was so dusty inside that they could see their footprints on the floor. There was no sign of the man they saw. That guy must have been up to something shady because he kept ducking away from us and hiding his face.